What is philosophy and why do we need it so badly right now?
We live in a culture addicted to Vita Activa. That is a drug, essentially. I mean, there are crude drugs, but the deeper cultural drug is this people's inability to be still. Philosophy is essentially saying there's much we don't know. We have limited faith in what we do know, and that's not a religious problem, that's a human problem.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome back to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today we have Professor Ron Dart with us here again. Ron is an expert on high Toryism, red Toryism, George Grant, Stephen Leacock, C.S. Lewis. He's written dozens of books and has served on so many different boards and societies and organizations dealing with an older high Tory loyalist tradition in Canada. So I enjoy Ron because of his generosity. He and I come at things differently. He's classically trained. He knows all the people in the high Tory tradition. He's friends with them. He's had supper with them. And I did not come from that tradition at all. Professor Dart has, right from the start, been deeply involved in a much broader sense of knowledge. So our discussion starts out with a focus on the Massey Report. And this is a report commissioned by a Liberal Prime Minister, Louis St. Laurent, in 1948, or in the late 40s, shortly after the World War II. And between 1948 and 1951, the Massey Commission, led by Vincent Massey, did its work trying to figure out what does Canada need to survive as a nation. They had experienced propaganda in World War II, and they knew that bad ideas can tear a country apart. There's one submission in particular from George Grant, and George Grant, as you know, Canadian philosopher, and he writes his chapter on philosophy and how a particular understanding of philosophy is necessary for the health of a nation. Philosophy can't pretend to be a scientific enterprise or a technique. If it does, it just promotes skepticism and it doesn't have any content of its own. And so we need to find ourselves in this new era, which is something, of course, that every generation has to go and do on its own all the time. Anyways, I'm rambling. Please hit like and subscribe, and let's get on with the show. Welcome back, Ron Dart.
Oh, a pleasure to be with you.
I appreciate you making time. You shared a video that you had done, I think it was 10 years ago, actually, an interview that you had done. And in it, you mentioned the Massey Report and the Massey Commission. And you mentioned that George Grant made a submission to it. And I thought, doggone it, I'm going to dig that out. And it has been a real epiphany for me. So I want you to tell us the story of the Massey Report. Maybe we'll just start with an introduction. You tell us what it is, and then I'll read a few quotes from it after that.
Yeah, the Massey Commission, well, actually, Vincent Massey was George Grant's uncle. So there's this obviously family connections here, and it was a very controversial article on philosophy that Grant submitted, but the underlying it was after World War II, the question for Canada and for Canadians is what does it mean as we move forward in history, given our past, to shape our unique destiny, which is not necessarily French and British, but it's not American. So how do we understand our emerging identity, given we're leaving behind elements of our history? We're still connected to it, but we have to also define ourselves differently. But we're also on the border of the biggest emerging empire, the New Rome in that sense. And so the Massey Commission was an attempt to bring together in an interdisciplinary manner a way of understanding and articulating as best as we could by bringing men and women from various disciplines together to say, this is what we think we are, and this is the path we think we're going to take. And these various essays were an attempt to articulate that at that just post-World War II period. It was a form of, in one sense, Canadian nationalism, a thoughtful nationalism, not a silly nationalism, but attempt to be moderate and thoughtful. And George Grant was asked by his uncle, Vincent Massey, to do the main article in philosophy, which was it was one of the most controversial articles in Canadian philosophy, because the major sort of doyen of philosophy at U of T had an earlier dust-up with Grant, a book he'd done on Bacon, Francis Bacon, and Grant had dared in the late 40s to critique it. And who is this young buck who would dare to critique the grand master, the grand chess player of philosophy? And the story accelerates in terms of what happened at York University in its founding. We can go into some of that if you want, or we can linger at the actual article Grant wrote in which he critiqued the emerging philosophic establishment that was following a scientific approach and positivism, and how Fulbert Anderson drew from Bacon. I think he misread Bacon in many ways, and sadly so Bacon has become a bit of a whipping boy these days for people who see our environmental crisis and science as perhaps being too dominant and hence concealing important elements of reality. I think there's a misread of Bacon. He's a far more complex and nuanced thinker, and I think he has to be given his fair share, and he's not being given it. But the Grant, Fulbert Anderson, Bacon, and then finally Grant resigning from York. I can get into that bigger story, but if you'd like to talk more about the philosophy article and then go into the bigger story, we can do both, whatever you fancy.
So you've already read my mind. You know that I'm wanting to go into that philosophy article. Before we get there, though, I want to just spend a moment on the Massey report. I've actually taped up these quotes on my wall behind my computer. This is from Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 5 of the Massey Report, 1951. Quote, "Canada became a national entity because of certain habits of mind and convictions which its people shared and would not surrender. Our country was sustained through difficult times by the power of this spiritual legacy. It will flourish in the future in proportion as we believe in ourselves. It is the intangibles which give a nation not only its essential character, but its vitality as well. What may seem unimportant or even irrelevant under the pressure of daily life may well be the thing which endures, which may give a community its power to survive." End quote. And so you were saying how there was a felt need, and actually it was a liberal prime minister, right? They were worried, especially given World War II and the role that propaganda played to destroy the character or the spirit within a nation, that the Liberal Party was especially worried that this was an issue. And so they commissioned this massive report. And one of my friends, when I told him about it, a physician, he said, "Well, Shawn, they usually do these sort of things when the truth of the report has already been starting to fade into the past. People already know none of this is true." So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Was this done because the whole concept of Canada was already dying? Or was it more hopeful? What are your thoughts on the report as a whole? It's a gigantic document. I don't expect all your thoughts, but what is your overall sense of the report?
Well, sure, there's obviously the cynical approach that the vision was dying, it was vanishing, that period of history had disappeared, and this was just more a postmortem. The other, which is, I think, a little truer without ignoring perhaps the cynical as well, is that post-World War II, Canada was trying to understand itself, realized very clearly that the United States had come out the great victor of World War II. We were on the border of an emerging empire, and how are we to navigate and find our way culturally, intellectually, educationally, politically, economically, socially, all these variations that make us human. And so the Massey Commission, positively speaking rather than negatively, will not ignoring on the other hand the potential more cynical approach, it was a positive attempt to move Canada forward amongst the leaders of Canada, the men and women who are going to play a prominent role in defining Canada as we move post-World War II forward. And so I think it can be seen as a visionary document that draws from the best of the past, but realize that we're moving into the future. So what do we take of the best of the past while realizing there's elements of the past which are problematic. It says any history, there's wheat and tares, gold and dross. So let go of the tares and the dross. But what is the gold? And then on the other hand, where is the gold yet to mine that we have not yet mined? And so any nation has to always discern, given its history, where the gaffes were, where the inappropriate decisions were, but also where was the goodness. And there's a certain progressive view of history that only sees negativity in the past and only picks on tragic stories. And then it gives people the sense, well, why would we care about the past if it's just darkness, despair, brutality, settler colonial stories? And you want to say, well, that's a distortion of the past. There was also much good. So the Massey Commission was an attempt to smoke out the best and say, how can we be yet better? How can we be yet better given the fact we are not British or French anymore, but there is a richness there, but we don't want to be Americans. And in one sense, you have to understand George Grant's Lament for a Nation. It's a reflection to some degree on the Massey Commission as well.
Love that. Yeah. So we're just about getting into Grant, and I want you to tell the story of his kerfuffle with York University. But just before we go there, I want to read my second real favorite quote from this Massey report. It goes like this. It's just from in the same part 1, chapter 1, but section 6. And it says this. He's talking about the forces that created Canada. It says this, quote, "These forces are not to be found in the material sphere alone. Physical links are essential to the unifying process, but true unity belongs to the realm of ideas. It is a matter for men's minds and hearts. Canadians realize this and are conscious of the importance of national tradition in the making." End quote. And so you're welcome to comment on that, but I'm also dying to hear you tell the story, very, very famous story of Grant's dust up with York University. So take it away.
Yes, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, Vincent Massey was George Grant's uncle. So many were the discussions over dinners and in other situations between Vincent Massey and George Grant, and Massey and his wife, which was Grant's aunt, they'd often be there for dinner. And so Grant comes out of a heritage of a thoughtful nationalism that was concerned with the material good of a people, but also the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual life of a people as well. So maybe just to pivot then to late 1940s, Fulbert Anderson was the dominant philosopher of Canada at University of Toronto. University of Toronto had the biggest philosophy department in Canada. It still is one of the largest, and no one dared to question Anderson. If you did, you were in trouble. A bit authoritarian. And he'd done a book on Francis Bacon, a bit of an idealized view of Bacon, and for many, Bacon has become a bit of a nemesis for environmental activists who saw nature as something you had to control, dominate, and it was the problem. He and Locke take an equal beating for some of this. And Grant, in a review, as a younger man, he dared to question both Anderson and Bacon, and it was like, who is this young man who dares to oppose me? And Grant at that time was teaching philosophy at Dalhousie. He was the point person there, very well known because of the Grant family. His grandfather started Queen's University, moved it from a small Presbyterian college to what it has become today, and did at that time one of the dominant universities. His other grandfather started the Rhodes Scholarship in Canada as well, and then his father was the principal of Upper Canada College. And so the Grant family were a fairly prominent family in terms of education, religion, politics, and family. And of course, the Vincent Massey connection is very significant in that as well. So Fulton Anderson then, so there's this dust up in the late 40s. And then when Vincent Massey, rather than asking Fulton Anderson to write the article on philosophy for the Massey Commission, he asks George Grant. This was an insult to Fulbert Anderson, that why would he ask this young person who dared to criticize me to do the significant article in the Massey Commission on philosophy. And Grant was also critiquing the drift and direction of philosophy, of which Anderson was a key driver. And so Grant was saying philosophy, above all else, is about wisdom. It's about insight. It's about going deeper into a person's internal life, understanding complex desires and longings and affections, and knowing who we are not, what it means to go slow and to listen. And philosophy is not about a chess game of dissecting ideas, and whether it's inductive, deductive, abductive logic, empirical ways of knowing. Grant said that's necessary, and it does play its role in revealing elements of which science and other disciplines like that can reveal, but it also conceals significant elements of what it means to be a thoughtful person in terms of being educated, engaging larger issues. So this second clash between Anderson and Grant then really blew up, became a Vesuvius in the early 1960s when York University was starting, and Grant was asked to be the first chair of the philosophy department at York. And he resigned his position at Dalhousie philosophy, moved with the family, quite a few kids at the time, and he put together the course outline in which they would be immersed in Plato, best of the Christian philosophical, theological tradition as it had developed over thousands of years. And the course was set to go, and the president of York, of course, the first 2 years of a young university, they're under the clucking wings of an older university, in principle, just to make sure they're following standards which are meaningful for a proper education. Well, you'll never guess who, of course, was the person who was going to do the scanning of Grant's courses, Fulbert Anderson. And Anderson says, I'm just not going to accept those courses. He says the notion of classical philosophy and the contemplative and wisdom, these are irrelevant. They're things of the past. Bacon is the man forward for us, in a certain read of Bacon also, I might add. And he said to Grant, these are the books you have to use if you're going to get the tick of the box, as it were, the imprimatur from the philosophy department at U of T. And Grant said, well, that's betraying the students. I would never teach my students that version of philosophy in which the notion of the contemplative and wisdom and internal soul searching, public responsibility are not an integrated vision the way Western philosophy has always understood things. Well, Anderson's, well, I'm going to be evaluating your students. And if you don't use the books that and they're essentially books in terms of philosophy is about cynicism. You can't believe anything or trust anything substantively. And Grant said, the last thing I want my students to do is graduate and become skeptics and cynics. And then they withdraw from public life, public responsibility. They lack any ethical center or core. So it became quite a tension for Grant. And so the president of York said, listen, just for 2 years, do what you're told. Grant says, I'll be sacrificing students 2 years of their life. And so, and of course, the tension with Anderson was a historic one. So Grant said, I just cannot do that for 2 years in good conscience. So he said to the president, he says, I either resign or you allow me to teach what I think is significant for what philosophy has been historically as a discipline of formation, of insight, of wisdom, of taking people to places in their journey in which they have to reflect what is the best life, what is the good, the better, the best, what are the virtues, what are the vices, how do we understand those in thought, word, and deed. And so what inevitably happened is the president said, well, listen, I have no choice because we're under 2 years of U of T. Well, Grant says, well, I'm resigning then. Well, you can't resign. You've got a growing family. You'll have no money. Well, Grant said, that's conscience. I have to make that decision. And so he was one of the first to be hired at York and one of the first to resign. Fortunately, because he was emerging in the late 50s, early 60s as a recoverer of some of the great works of literature. So Adler and Hutchins were doing all this work on the great books. So they contacted George and Sheila, and they said, listen, we'll give you about 70 books to review for us, and then we can pay you for a couple of years, and then that will take you through at least a year or two, and hopefully you'll get a job at that point. And it was in that period of time then, Grant was out of teaching at a formal university that was actually the Anglican Church of Canada, the person who was the head of at this education for the Anglican Church of Canada. Grant happened, Michael Creo was his name, he just died a couple of years ago. A wonderful person. And Grant was in the office, and person who taught history at Mac University said, listen, we're wanting to start a department of religious studies, which is not an echo of the divinity school, the Baptist divinity school at Mac. He said, do you know anyone who had the ability and the capacity to teach the best of philosophical, political, religious thought that we could start religious studies at Mac? And he said, well, George Grant's right in the office. And so Michael Creel Grant and the person who taught history at Mac met. And it's out of that, the origins of really our best religious studies department in Canada was formed. And Grant was the founder, and all the other religious studies department in Canada are largely founded on the Mac approach. But it was this disappointment with Anderson York that led to the founding via Grant's being as faithful to conscience as possible, and for what seemed to be bearing the consequences with a growing family and no job, that then led to the founding of religious studies. And religious studies at Mac, because that's where I did my PhD, it was not religious studies in a narrow sense. The whole format, in fact, you were immersed in classical studies, and it was also political philosophy. And so it was not a narrow sort of divinity education. It was a total immersion in the history of Western philosophy, theology, political thought, literature, and highly interdisciplinary. And Grant really, it was really the old humanities in that sense. And so it's I've done a variety of articles on that as well, but it's the backstories to our educational institutions and the initial disappointments lead to greater possibilities when seen retrospectively.
Yeah. I thank you so much for sharing that story. I've heard bits and pieces of it, but it wasn't until you shared the full thing that it made so much more sense. Yeah, you brought it alive. Mm-hmm. And I want to read two quotes that relate to your comments, but just before I do, you mentioned that Mac started out as a Baptist school of theology. So that's my background, is from the Baptist tradition. I'm not sure that they would accept me in it anymore. They say you're as soon as you start reading history, you kind of get kicked out perhaps, or you're not a member in good standing. But how did the Baptists take to these classicists? Because that's a real pivot. And now maybe that's way too far down a rabbit hole for this podcast, but I couldn't resist asking you that. Was there tension there? Did the Baptists threaten to burn the school down, or what happened?
Well, I think they realized, because the Baptist seminary at Mac was its own reality. It was training in their time men to become Baptist ministers. Religious studies was a public university, so they had no say over what was going on at a public university. And Grant was modeling a classical education, of which most Baptists just do not have that history, drawing from the classical world of Homer and Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and then how the Christian tradition synthesized the best of the biblical tradition, which obviously the Baptists would be very indebted to, a certain read of it anyway, and then the classical tradition, of which the patristic era, East and West, drew from in the 2nd to the 7th century. So they were in two separate worlds, two cultures that really had nothing in common in one sense, in terms of their understanding of education, formation, religion, politics, and this.
Right.
So Grant didn't have a lot to do with the actual Baptist seminary at Mac in his creative years of starting religious studies at McMaster University.
Interesting. So thank you for that. And I also wanted to just highlight, you mentioned Grant acting on conscience. And one of the things when we were in the green room, I said, if you want, perhaps we can talk about Sophocles' play Antigone. And that's exactly on conscience. So maybe you planted that little shiny object there for me to tie the show together. I'm not sure. But I wanted to read just your comments about the difference in what is philosophy. So how do we teach philosophy? And that's getting us into Grant's essay. And one line here, it's on my page too, but anyways, it's partway into the essay. He says this, quote, "Philosophy is not in essence a technique. Its purpose is to relate and see in unity all techniques, so that the physicist, for instance, can relate his activity to the fact of moral freedom. The economists see the productive capacity of his nation in relation to the love of God," end quote. So there he's throwing in his theological background. And then this other sentence, you mentioned philosophy as purely negative. A little bit further in the essay, he says this, quote, "Yet it would seem that unless philosophy is to become a purely negative discipline, it must have some kind of dependence on faith, whatever that may be. Reason not guided by faith cannot but find itself in the position of destroying everything and establishing nothing. And though one of the roles of philosophy must be destructive and critical, if it is the only role, it cannot hope to have any profound or abiding influence on society," end quote. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is because there's a risk on two sides, I think, of interpreting his use of the word faith as being purely in a religious sense. And something that it's been a bit of a theme or a hobby horse for me, is the notion that there's no such thing as a view from nowhere, right? Thomas Nagel wrote his famous essay, A View from Nowhere. Even to do science, you have to have a bunch of priors to get towards the scientific answers you're hoping to come up with. Well, that in itself is something we bring to our discussion, whether it's in the clinic or in the science lab. And there are multiple other examples, math, logic, language. And so given that Grant is really highlighting a first principles difference in what is philosophy about. And that takes us to the opening of his article where he talks about the contemplative life versus the active life. And you've mentioned this, in fact, in our last interview or podcast, you mentioned it. You mentioned it in the video that I just watched, that you shared. But then he actually opens his article this way. So I wonder if you could dilate on and contrast the difference between the contemplative and the active as Grant would see them.
Yeah, lovely questions. What's emerged in a certain type of philosophy from certainly late scholasticism of the Middle Ages up through the rise of a certain type of science in the 17th, 18th century, and then how philosophy really was taken captive by that. In late medieval scholasticism, you get in Aquinas and people that philosophy is about premise, conclusion, and you follow logical arguments, and if it's not logical, then it's not valid, it's just private subjectivism in that way. Following that late medieval scholastic logical approach, then the empirical approach became dominant, and quite legitimately so, for certain reasons of which Francis Bacon is a key in his Novum Organum, his New Atlantis, these works, in that the empirical approach to knowing can reveal things which a purely philosophical approach that's not grounded in the empirical can be a bit of ignoring what the empirical can reveal for us and give to us in terms of medicine, in terms of dealing with illnesses, in terms of plagues and illnesses and diseases. And a person just can't say, well, if you're ill or you're dying, it's God's will or God's going to heal you. No, that's not how things work. And so the rise of a certain type of empiricism for many people was a victory in terms of moving history forward, in terms of bringing possibilities of humanity in which the material conditions of life could be much more meaningful. And the sheer positive nature of that co-opted an understanding of philosophy that the only way to know meaningfully was the empirical, logical way, and what could not be verified or falsified through an empirical means, or positivism or phenomenology later on, was not philosophy. And so the mind became this hyperactive organ or faculty, constantly attempting to bring certainty and answers to the questions of life that could be solved through investigation, through an empirical, logical way of knowing. And this Vita Activa did produce much good, and I don't think anyone would deny that. And there are certain people who are nostalgic about the past that say, if we just get back to that, given the time we live in, you want to say, you want to go back to that, and you want an empirical understanding, a healthy history. Well, you know, the empirical, logical way does reveal very important elements of life, but it also conceals significant elements that humanity is at its best was the aesthetics, the arts, poetry, literature, religion, reveal to us. And there has been a whole movement in philosophy. You certainly get the counter to that from the rationalist tradition in the Enlightenment to the romantic tradition, basically saying, well, what about imagination? What about intuition? What about what the heart speaks to us? So what happens? You get this division between the heart and the head. My head tells me one thing that's true. My heart, which is subjective, can't be counted on. And so you get schizophrenic people in terms of their personality. Now, Grant's understanding of the contemplative in that older sense, the notion of the faculty within, it's called nous, or a noetic way of being, in which the interior attentiveness, this is why he was drawn to Simone Weil, for example, and many others for that matter, just not her, but she became his diatema of sorts, is what do we know about ourselves and our journey through being still? We live in a culture addicted to Vita Activa. That is a drug, essentially. I mean, there are crude drugs, but the deeper cultural drug is this people's inability to be still. But what is revealed in stillness and the discipline and the cultivation of stillness, which is itself a discipline that takes us deeper into ourself and can reveal much about ourselves that in our busyness is concealed from us. And so classical thought, I'm teaching a course this summer because the film coming out on Homer's Odyssey will be coming out. And I'll be looking at how the classical tradition and the early Christian tradition read Homer allegorically. So not just the literal return of Odysseus back to Ithaca, but in fact, what were the many diversions he took in which he, in one sense, wasted part of who he could be and took a much longer to get home to Ithaca, which led to his son not having a father, Telemachus, his wife, Penelope, having to deal with suitors who were taking advantage of her. And because Odysseus, the wily Odysseus, did not know himself in the depths, he was a wily activist, but the price he paid for that was tragedy in relationships and tragedy in friendships as well, because many of the friends who left Troy died on the way home because of bad decisions. So philosophy, it takes a person deeper within in terms of listening. How do I make wise choices? And who are the friends who are, that meant philosophy, philosophia in that Greek sense, is of the Greek words for friendship and love. Philia is the Greek word, and Sophia obviously is wisdom. And so philosophy or philosophia is about the love of Lady Wisdom, drawing, leading people. That's good, and that involves a certain level of contemplative listening and hearing in the company of others who are listening and hearing. That's quite different than the mind being an active agent, analyzing, processing, diagnosing, and even, well, you would even know in medicine, of course, part of it is science, but part of it's guesswork. You're dealing with the ambiguities of the human body, and you can get some things right, but there's some guesswork involved as well. And that's the same in political philosophy, religions. That's where faith comes in, is, okay, we have this evidence, it's limited, but we can trust elements of that, but there's far more to dealing with larger issues of political philosophy, religion, aesthetics, the arts, ethics, all of these humanities in that sense. So there's knowing at a certain point, what do we know and what do we not know? And how do we navigate with what we don't know? And so the contemplative is an attempt to, how do you live in this tension? The gnosis, the knowing, but the agnosis, the not knowing. And this is a difficult tension, and most people want to know, they want certainty. Philosophy is essentially saying, there's much we don't know. We have limited faith in what we do know, and that's not a religious problem, that's a human problem. We all have faith. When I went to school in Switzerland in the early 70s, and one of the first books we had to read was Polanyi's Personal Knowledge. And so, I mean, you're already dealing with, science recognizing we bring to whatever we're studying or investigating our history, our temperament. There's been a variety of always many good books on science that look at scientists come with worldviews. They have to change paradigms based on what they think is certain, and then it changes. And so faith is not a religious issue, it's a human issue.
Yeah.
Always the question is, what do you have faith in?
Yeah.
And what you have will betray you in the long run. And philosophies are trying to discern what is the mystery of faith we're turning to, and will it betray us, or will it lead into depth and insight and wisdom, and higher than that, love, of course, because of the hierarchy of knowing, knowledge, information, statistics is the lowest. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Then wisdom, and then love is the highest of all ways, which is a participatory way of knowing. It's not standing back and examining something as an object, and that in principle is to give you objective information. Well, that is one way of knowing, but the participatory way, or the noetic way of knowing, which Grant would be discussing really in his philosophy essay in the Massey Commission, was about what does a participatory way of knowing reveal to us that a merely detached way of knowing conceals from us? And how do both need to be brought together? It's not either or. It's knowing where each territory is legitimate and where they can work together as dancing partners. Bunyan has a lovely saying, it's he footed it well and she answered him handsomely. And so these different ways of knowing are both appropriate within certain spheres of knowing. And what Grant is objecting to, and which his challenge with Anderson was about, is you are so frozen in a certain way of knowing, in fact, and it leads to cynicism and skepticism. So your faith is in skepticism, but where does that take a person at the end of the day? To a cliff's edge, and it leads to paralysis. So on the other hand, what is the good of a certain type of skepticism and cynicism that can reveal to us a bigger world also? And so there's, again, skepticism, cynicism, doubting, agnosticism. How does it open us up to certain goods that an unhealthy certainty prevents us from seeing? And so his article on, and part of he's engaging with Fulbert and Anderson, who's, philosophy equals a certain limited empirical, logical way of knowing in which you doubt everything, you believe nothing, and the only thing you believe is doubt. Yeah. And so but the doubters doubting, or the skeptics are the skeptical of skepticism. And so Grant was really locking horns at a pretty high level when he collided with Anderson on where philosophy, where it had come to dominate. He became the king on the throne, and it brooked no opposition. And unless thinkers are willing to genuflect to that way of knowing, they'd be turfed from the castle of knowing. And so Grant was an opponent of that, and he had to pay the price for it. But I think Grant is well known now, and everyone forgets Fulbert Anderson.
Oh, beautiful. That was just a beautiful string of comments. I wrote so many notes, and I'll just pick up on your last comment about faith in skepticism and not doubting our doubt. It's that emphasis of skepticism being the only thing that is real that Grant argues in his article is what pushes students away from philosophy. They say, well, if you don't even believe in yourself, why waste our time? Let's get on with learning science so we can go make some money. But I just wanted to share a few other comments that you made. Polanyi's Personal Knowledge. I haven't read the whole thing very carefully, but I love that book. He was a surgeon, and there's a section in the book where he talks about the knowledge you have of the 3D. You as a surgeon, you or as someone who's operating on someone, inside your bowels, it's like a bag of half-inflated water balloons covered in slime. And so you need to have a 3D impression of where the anatomical structures are. Where would the ureter be? Don't want to cut that. Where would the major vessels be? Don't want to cut that. And when you open the belly, even today when you have beautiful images, 3D CAT scans, as soon as you open it, those CAT scan images are gone because everything changes. Some of the pus oozes out or the intestines flop from one side or the other. And so he said, you're sticking your hands deep inside this cavity and you need to have an awareness, a tacit knowledge, a knowledge that transcends something. It goes beyond something that you can simply write out in a paragraph in a book. And so that's what I love about him. And then when you talk about certainty and rationalism, and when I'm talking to my rationalist friends and colleagues, there's a lot of us in the STEM fields, unreflective rationalists. I find a way, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, I find a way to break into that rationalism is to start with something that they already believe to be true. And I'm thinking of Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is just a fancy mathematical calculation where you add up all the probabilities of a particular thing being true. And even if you have limited evidence, because we always have limited data, we never have enough data, you can come up with a probability that says, well, it probably is a duck. Looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. It probably is a duck, even if we're not 100% sure. But the whole premise of Bayesian epistemology is admitting and embracing a fairly significant element of uncertainty. Uncertainty is part of your knowing. And so I use that as a way, very rationalist, mathematical kind of way, to get my rationalist colleagues to admit that, oh yeah, I guess we do have an element of uncertainty. One of my friends calls it defeasible warrant. We need to have defeasible warrant built into our decision-making apparatus so that we can say, yeah, there's stuff we don't know. Do you think that, am I just giving up the farm when I try to use a mathematical formula to convince people that there's more to life than math? Or would you just say, no, better to tell them to read Plato?
Yeah. You know, one of my favorite philosophers is Friedrich Nietzsche. I was very fortunate to spend time at his home in Sils Maria, the Engadine Valley, just south of St. Moritz, where he lived and some of his finest thinking emerged. And he was on the cusp of a certain type of rationalist enlightenment thinking, which he metaphorically called Apollo, the Apollonian person who through the mind could bring certainty, clarity, could answer all the tough questions of life via science and reason and empiricism. And this was the Apollonian person. And through the will could create a better world. So both intellectually could bring conclusions to all the big questions, and through the will could bring into being the better world. In that sense, comedy in not a silly sense, but we through our thinking and through our will could answer all the difficult questions of life and create a better world in that sense. And Nietzsche was living at a period of time at the very peak of Enlightenment rationalism, the right wing of the Enlightenment anyway. And so, but he also posited the Dionysian person, who is the person of intuition, of imagination, of feeling, who understood also that Apollo could not solve all the problems of the world. And there are surds in this life, and there are unpredictabilities in this life. And we can conjecture, we can posit, we can think we can solve it. But Dionysus basically lets you know there are, in fact, many things that we cannot control, we cannot answer fully, comprehensively, or exhaustively. And there are many things in life that through our will, we are not going to bring health and healing to. There are these elements of life. And the Dionysian person brought together the tragic element of life. That Apollo cannot solve all the problems in life as much as we bow before Apollo. Dionysus is the one that lets us know there are these unpredictables. These are these things we can't cognitively sort out, bring final certainty to. There are these things in our will through addictions, bad choices, political clashes, AI information. It's not going to work. That's just the human nature, and the human condition is such. There is the tragic element as well. So how do we live with Dionysius and Apollo? How do we live with the tragic and the comedic intention? And that's part of the brilliance of Nietzsche in terms of realizing, yes, there is much good the mind and the will can bring it, but there's also limitations. And it goes back to the Greek myth, of course, of the Pandora's box, of Prometheus warning his brother not to open it, and Epimetheus not having the smarts to gratefully hope came out at the end. But so I would say, I would say as long as people know how to honestly allow Apollo and Dionysius to live within them, both within and the external world they live in, within history itself, within contemporary reality, within the future, that the tragic and the comic, there's often, you've probably met many people in life who move forward with this very much Apollo, and then they hit suffering, they hit tragedy, they have hit the unpredictable, deaths, long-term illnesses, war, their throwinnesses in places that no one would want to be, tragic. And then the way people try and deal with it, the memories stay with them to the end. And so these two elements for people who go too far, I would say people go too far down the rational road are not rational enough, because they're not willing to deal with the ambiguity of the human condition, which Hannah Arendt talks about so wisely and well, given her a student of Heidegger and then her work afterwards in the United States and wonderful works. But yeah, my view always is rationalists are not rational enough. Skeptics are not skeptical enough. At a certain point, at a certain point, they won't go any further down the road in following where their thinking takes them. And I think Nietzsche understood, as would a Polanyi in that sense, as would any good scientist. Einstein, understood this very well. Even Bacon, who I mentioned earlier, his little work on wisdom of the ancients, he's very clear that, on the one hand, what he writes about Novum Organum and the New Atlantis always has to be balanced with the wisdom, all the myths of the ancient tradition about limits of choice, about limits of thinking, about limits of empiricism, and how these myths and these stories reveal to us a more complex and layered view of the world that we live in. And so, I would say absolutely what you're saying. And this is what Grant's grappling with as well. This is why in his latter years he was doing a great deal of work on Nietzsche and Heidegger. Nietzsche probably even more. He recognized that Nietzsche was a deep conservative in many ways, in terms he was conserving a more complex classical way of knowing as a corrective to a certain type of a rationalist read of the Greek tradition, but also an Enlightenment rationalism as well, and saying there's much good in that, but it also has very serious limitations. And if you genuflect to it uncritical, be careful, you may be worshiping a strange god in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to have to, I figured this would be the ultimate podcast. We'd solve all the problems. And now I'm thinking we need to have another talk about Nietzsche, because that's another favorite theme of mine for sure. And I like your suggestion for nuance with Bacon, because I've really taken, I think, perhaps a caricature of his New Atlantis and said, oh, this summarizes this whole guy. And clearly he's a simplistic rationalist. But okay, we have to watch the clock here, because we don't want to go, we could go for 2 or 3 hours, and I'm not going to do that. But before we leave Grant, and I want to pivot over to, you mentioned conscience, we mentioned Sophocles, and we have to get your thoughts on that, because you've done some writing on that just recently. But before we leave Grant's essay, he wrote this essay in the hope that we could resurrect the contemplative life in Canadian universities to the ultimate goal, telos, of getting a truer sense of philosophy, at least as he saw it, but also as having Canada transition from being a young country that was focused on survival and material issues, and to grow up, shall we say, into a more mature understanding that sees ourselves not just as people who are here in the pursuit of houses and cars and retirement plans, but actually part of a much, many, many thousands of years of history behind us. So I wonder if you could talk about, I couldn't find the exact sentence, but he makes this comment that about philosophy. I've been despairing that, I've asked a number of guests, I've said, well, so are you asking us to read 2,000 years of thought, and we're supposed to absorb all of that to rescue Canada? And Grant makes the point. He says, no, he said, philosophy is not cumulative. A cumulative understanding of knowledge is thinking of it in a scientific way, shall we say. Science and technology builds on what was discovered before. Philosophy and philosophers have to rediscover all of philosophy every generation. So every philosopher has to embrace all the greats of the philosophical works and shape their intellect by that. And that happens over and over each generation. So we're actually not asking people to somehow write a science test on everything that's been discovered since the Greeks. He's actually saying philosophy is getting your head shaped by a wholeness, a sense of knowledge, as opposed to the specifics of knowledge. So I'm not sure if any of that makes sense to you, but I wonder if if you've had thoughts on the difference between a cumulative sense of knowledge, where just we're piling facts on top of each other, as opposed to a holistic sense of knowledge. I know that even that term is loaded, but whether or not that offers a opportunity for us to rescue Canada, if we could just get people thinking more in terms of this a holistic sense of knowledge. But tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think one of the dilemmas with a progressive view of history, what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery, is that the past does not have quite the same purchasing power, as it were, as the present and into the future. So then why would we waste our time other than what not to be, what not to think, what not to study? And that sort of arrogance or hubris, intellectual hubris, has left us somewhat bereft of, and it can be as benign as they're not quite as bright as us, to, no, it's a dark age and they were brutal, they were violent, so we've grown beyond that, and that approach it's intellectually shallow and silly and really not even worthy going to. Past is a great polyphony of women and men reflecting on what does it mean to be human. Are we merely animals who have physical needs, and beyond that there's nothing? What are our psychological needs? What are our spiritual needs? What does it mean to be a complex human being, pulled to and fro by different wants and longings and hungers and desires? I mean, Plato used the image of the horse. You've got the dark horse, the light. I mean, most people today would say, yeah, of course I've got this potentially destructive side, I've got this mediocre side, and I have this good side. Well, Plato understood this, Aristotle did, Homer did, the tragedians. So in terms of the classical understanding of human nature, they understood the complexity of it. And certain forms of modern psychology certainly understand that. And so philosophy in that sense is wisdom. Wisdom in terms of trying to make sense of what is human nature, what is its distortion, what is its aberration, what is the best, what is the worst. And these are all both wrestling and grappling with individuals as well as cultures, as well as families, as well as relationships. And so those who turn against that and either only see the good or only see the negative distort the complex nature of the... And so this polyphony of thousands of years, not only Western culture, but anyone who, I mean, Grant just loved Gandhi as well, and Grant thought comparative civilizations. The danger sometimes in the world we live in, particularly in the West, and depending on whether a person's on the right or the left, if they're on the right, we got to get back to the classics of the West. And you want to say, well, the human journey is also cosmopolitan. And there are other great cultures and civilizations of women and men who have lived very substantive and meaningful lives, who've grappled with philosophy, theology, political responsibility. And so Grant thought very much comparative literature. When I was at Mac, we had to thoroughly immerse ourselves in Eastern thought. We had three major areas: the classics of Western civilization, classics of Eastern. I mean, I did my comprehensives of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. Obviously, the Gita was a small little book, and then in the great Chinese works of Tao Te Ching and these works. And then biblical studies was the third level. I focused more on Western culture and Eastern culture, but we all had to focus on all of them. But yeah, the word Catholic, katholos, means the whole. And so Catholic, not Roman Catholic, but katholos. And so this polyphonic Catholicity and sitting with those who have been before us and listening to what they see as wisdom and insight can give us, if we have ears to hear, ways in Canadian context of moving forward in terms of defining what it means to be Canadian, allowing the best insights of women and men of the past to speak to us from the past. This is why I think in the Christian tradition you have the communion of the saints of the great cloud of witnesses who they live, they're dead, but they still live. They've crossed the river, but they're still living, and they can whisper to us if we have ears to hear. And so there is this rich heritage. But again, I think I mentioned at the end of the last reflection we did together, memoricide. So when people have no memory, they either have caricatures of the past or they have no understanding of the past. And we all know if we went to bed at night and woke up in the morning and had no memory, we don't know how to navigate. Same with a culture. Same with a political tradition, a religious tradition, an educational tradition. Because who we are to some degree is the accumulation of memories. And then discerning memories as well. There can be painful memories and there can be informational memories, all of these things. And so these, this is why good education, educara in that sense, is drawing out who each person is meant to be within the context of how others have thought what the good life is. I don't know if that makes any sense, but...
No, that's excellent. And I'm conscious of the time, but I'm desperate to ask you about Sophocles. Do you have another 5 or 10 minutes?
Sure. Yes,
okay,
yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to turn my mind again, like we were just saying, Grant is thinking practically, how can we rescue Canada? Roger Scruton said conservatism is a work of rescue. So with that sense of rescue in mind, what can we offer people as a practical thing to start when they're dipping into some of these older texts? And I just read Sophocles Antigone again this weekend. Short play. I don't think I've actually read it right through. I've only read summaries of it. Just a fantastic tragedy. And so all of our listeners, go grab your Sophocles, read Antigone again. Fantastic, tragic, it'll break your heart. You've just written a piece on it with respect to COVID, and I think you're going to teach, oh no, you're teaching a course on Homer. Anyways, you've done some thinking on Sophocles again, on Antigone. Could you just tell us the story of Antigone, just briefly, a few lines, or as long as you want, and then tell us your reflections on how a piece of literature from the 5th century before Christ is actually applicable to the COVID pandemic. So go ahead, take it away.
Well, yeah, not only the COVID, but the culture wars that we're living in today is way where you get polarization and people don't listen to one another. And when people get frozen into certain interpretations economically, culturally, they don't, tragedy is and Sophocles understood this very clearly, that where there is deafness on both sides, you get tragedy. And Aeschylus is the great Greek tragedian. Sophocles is wonderful. And of course, Euripides is a little different than the other two, but Antigone's a great play of Sophocles making it very clear that when people are not listening to one another, both suffer. Fragmentation occurs, relational breakdown occurs, and so at the heart of the play, Antigone, is there has been a war. And as a result of the war, one of the members of one of the royal families was seen as a traitor to the polis, this particular city in the play. He was killed in the war as a traitor, and his sister Antigone felt that he needed a proper state burial. Creon was the head of the state. His concern after war is that order, predictability, stability from chaos had to be the dominant motif at this period of time anyway, given what they had lived through. And so here you have on the one hand, Creon, the head of state, holding a position that there can be no opposition, because the very person that's lying dead was the head of the opposition that created the war. And his sister wants to give him a state burial, which would reinforce being a traitor or questioning the state. This is Antigone. So Antigone's position is, he is my brother. I'm soon to be married into your family, your son. He should have a state burial. Creon said, to do so would send out a message to people that traitors who brought war to the state are to be honored. Well, that sends a message to all sorts of people. Well, Creon says he is my brother, and I think he should have a state funeral. And so what you get is a clash between Creon, who's trying to bring stability, order, predictability, rightness to the state, and to give people a sense of confidence again. And Antigone says, no, my individual liberty is primary and my care for my brother is central. So you have this clash between individuality and the state, and both are not listening to one another. Both are frozen. It's like Satan at the lowest level of Dante's Inferno. He's frozen in ice, but he's flapping out of control, but he's going nowhere. And so Dante saw very well how a certain type of ideology leads to uber busyness, but a going nowhere, you're frozen. And so for Sophocles, the issue is what happens, and this could be individuality in the state, it can be family issues where people get stuck in certain interpretations of economics or religion or politics or a whole range of things. What happens when reason becomes frozen into a certain interpretation of a particular issue and they're not listening to others? So what Sophocles is getting at, and of course all the great Greeks were, is that reason has to be a supple organ. It has to know its limitations, and particularly what can a reasonable person learn from those who oppose them or interpret things very, very differently. Now, the tragedy of Antigone is that both Antigone and Creon take the position that they are defending what is the best, the true, and the most noble. One, the family, Antigone and her brother. The other, not only the family and the state. And they refuse to budge. Their mind has become fixated on a certain interpretation, and the other is the opponent or the enemy. One, she's going to undermine the state, and then for him, for her perspective, he doesn't honor the family. He doesn't honor relationships at all. He's willing to sacrifice friendships and family for the good of the state. And so the tragedy for Sophocles is what happens when people get in a place where their own approach to their own sense of identity, hot button issues in the culture wars, they cease to have the ability to hear the other who differs with them. Well, what of course happens is that Antigone dies in the play itself. I mean, Creon really realizes at the end his decision was wrong because she was about to marry his son. His son, she says, "Do you know what you've done?" And he begins to relent, but it's too late. She's in the cave, which is a sense, it takes you right back to Homer, the cave of the Cyclops. So as soon as you get cave images, you got Plato cave. And so what Sophocles is doing with the cave and the Antigone, he's playing with all of these very important themes which are central to Greek thought. How do you get out of the cave of narrow thinking, reductionistic thinking, shadow thinking? And so it's a warning to people who think through the use of thinking, they know what the answer is in this situation, whether it can be family dynamics, whether it can be politics, whether it can be medicine or education or any area. So it's essentially a gentle call to just have a little intellectual humility or agnosis in that sense, be a little agnostic, a little skeptical, because that can be a pathway into listening to the other person. When it doesn't happen, you get tragedy. So it's a clarion call to intellectual humility, and that reason is limited, and listen to the other who may seem irrational to us, but is deeply insightful and rational from their perspective.
Yeah.
So you get a collision of whose version of the content of reason.
Yeah. Beautifully said. So it's fascinating to hear you share that because, and I will, you're the expert. So this is me trying to disagree with the expert, which is never a wise thing to do ever, because you know this 10 times better than me. But when I read through it, I sided with Antigone. I felt like she's doing what she just knows to be right. In her discussion with her sister saying, "No, don't do this. This is bad. Don't disagree. You know, the king has said, thou shalt not go, and this guy's a traitor. Polanyi, your brother, is a traitor. He's going to rot outside the city, and the crows are going to pick his body clean." And Antigone is saying, "No, this is just wrong." She said, "The gods declare it. This is wrong. We will invite the wrath of the gods." And so she sneaks out and sprinkles dust on him and does whatever the Greeks do for anointing their dead, and so that she could placate the wrath of the gods. And this, of course, drives Creon nuts. To your point, you know, you're going to incite insurrection. How can you celebrate a traitor? But a lot of the play, at least as far as I could understand it, was dealing with Creon digging his heels in, to your point, and being proudful and saying, "No, I've made the decision and I'm sticking to it." And yet his leader and his court people, the singers, are saying, you know, "Hey, think twice about this. Listen, all the people in the city are taking Antigone's side, and, you know, it's not too late." And then the prophet comes in and says, "Listen, bad things are going to happen to you unless you recant and change your mind here." And of course, Antigone ends up dying, and then Creon's son commits suicide, and Creon's wife commits suicide. So all this disaster follows Creon coming up with an arbitrary law. He said, "I want order. I'm passing a law. You guys abide by it." And Antigone standing up to the state and saying, no, what you did is wrong. There's no legitimacy in the law that you just passed. I am going to do this, even if it means death for me. And so for me, it's fascinating to see how the ancients had a very different sense of what death meant. And death as an outcome of standing for your principles, yeah, bring it on. It speaks to heroism and sacrifice in war and dying for things you believe in, dying for your friends, dying for your city. So I very much sided with Antigone is fully correct. Creon is fully wrong. so you said it. The point of it is people digging in their heels, and I'm thinking, oh, I feel guilty. I've been digging in my heels. So I just had to share that with you.
Yeah, no, good. No, I mean, that Sophocles' point is that we tend to identify with either Creon or Antigone.
Yes.
And his point is be careful identifying with either.
Interesting.
Because both have their blind points and both have their good points. In an age of individualism and a certain understanding of principle, Antigone is held high as the great queen of integrity, conscience, integrity, virtues. Yeah. She can do no wrong, and Creon's the problem. If a person's more statist, then they say Creon is right, Antigone's the problem, and you want to say, whoa, be careful of that too. He was stubborn. I mean, he had his blind spots, his Achilles heels.
Yeah.
And so it was because of both of them didn't recognize their blind spots. That's the tragedy. But there's always this tendency in a play or in life itself. We identify with one of the protagonists and the other's the antagonist.
Right.
And then she becomes the heroine and he's the problem.
Yes.
And he gets his just desserts.
Yeah.
In one sense, well, you deserved it. And she didn't.
Yeah.
So we're identifying. So Sophocles' view is just be a little bit careful there.
Yeah.
Because they were both human. They both saw imperfectly and through a glass darkly. Yeah. They both stood by principle, even though they understood the content of that principle quite differently.
Yes.
And the play, the end, is tragic for both of them.
Yeah.
And so it's the warning is just be careful of unduly, in this play anyway, tipping the hat to Creon or to Antigone, because they're both right and wrong at the same time.
Yeah, so I love that you emphasize that, because obviously that was missed on me. Having said that, the early discussion between Antigone and her sister makes a lot of sense. And she's saying, hang on, listen, I agree with you. I love our brother also.
Sure,
However, that you're not seeing it. There's more than just love of our brother. And then also the debate or the discussion argument between Creon and his son. And his son is saying, hang on, Dad. Yes, you're wise and you're powerful. I see where you're going, but gosh, you really seem to be going too far with this. And so you find yourself agreeing with both sides of that discussion. So anyways, a shout out to Sophocles, Antigone. Go out, read the story. And I always ask everybody this question at the end of the podcast. You know I'm going to ask you, what do you wish we could have talked about? What did I forget to ask you in this brief conversation? What's keeping you awake at night?
Well, maybe even, I won't say it's keeping me awake, but maybe building on Antigone, Aeschylus's play, The Persians, is a very good one in which the Greeks had defeated the Persians. And for Aeschylus, how are you going to treat the enemy? Will you treat them kindly and well, or will you be brutal to them? And in an age again, and it was Aeschylus, like Sophocles and Euripides, they're masters of tragedy. And what happens when we get into polarized politics or polarized ways of seeing in which we're right, the other is wrong? In the Persians, it's a little higher. It has affinities, obviously, with Antigone, but it's the Greeks had finally defeated the Persians, but for Aeschylus, it's a warning. Don't treat them brutally. They're human beings. And it's a compassionate play by a leading Greek tragedian. Be careful. Be careful, because when you abuse other people, that will boomerang on yourself in time. And so This is why these great works of literature, not just Greek and Roman, but cosmopolitan literature, as I mentioned earlier, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the world literature, they bring us the great eternal truths that are constantly, Nietzsche understood what he called the eternal recurrence of the same. I remember sitting out where he had this epiphany, this eureka moment, spending an afternoon sitting, and the eternal recurrence of certain perennial themes of the human journey that just go round and round, recycled again and again in every generation. And we had mentioned earlier first principles. Some of these first principles are always in tension. Constantly, it's a tightrope of tensions. And I'd written out about 30 for you. We could, maybe another time, 30 tensions that have to be lived with, and what happens if you go off the tightrope one way or the other. And the history, the recycled history, is people going off one way or the other, and then the tragedy of that, whereas the comedic is more living in the tension. But it's much more difficult to live with competing tensions. So with the Antigone or the Creon, or with the Persians and the Greeks, how do you treat the other, this sort of story? So I would say it's I think one of the sadnesses every civilization faces, that people who don't know how to walk the tightrope of tensions. And I think in that sense what Sophocles is getting at is be careful of going Creon, Antigone, and then, as you mentioned as well, the siblings, confronting siblings and dads, saying, you're not listening. Okay, but not obstinately not listening, but then having lived with the consequences of not listening, both in family and in polis itself. So the sadnesses and the tragedies that occur when people, and that's where the contemplative comes back, because underneath the contemplative is an attentive listening.
Yeah.
An attentive listening to the self, the other, and then the larger, obviously, public issues where people become ideologically fragmented, and the dead end of that for, in this case, Canada on its journey.
Beautiful, beautiful comments. I had the thought when you were talking about how we treat other people impacts ourselves. And there's a famous passage where Edmund Burke is arguing against the British treatment of nationals in India. He said, we're asking our soldiers to do things that is ruining them for any further use. We won't be able to bring those soldiers home and ask them to do anything, because as humans, they are now ruined because of the terrible things we've asked them to do. And so that thought always comes to mind when we think about, it's not just a question of, am I going to do this or am I going to do that? But it's also a question of, if I do this, how will it change me? If I do that, how will it change me? Which is, again, more of a classical way of thinking of things. But anyways, Professor Dart, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you making the time. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Oh, well, I hope it made some minimal sense.
Always. Have a great day, my friend.